Oh, no fun. I thought we were getting cozy here. Can everyone hear me in the back? Cool. Get started in 1 more minute. There was no substantial charity offer made this year, so I blame you. Let's get cozy. I see plenty of open chairs. You can stand up right next to me if you want. I mean, that's cool too. Somebody. We good on the AV? Sure. All right, thanks everyone for coming. So the talk I'm giving today is how do I detect technique X in Windows? So I thought it would be valuable to give a talk like this, one, having asked the question myself enough times, and also having people come to me asking me that question so many times. In a previous life, having put out a lot of offensive techniques, I got this question a lot. And to be honest, up until a certain point, probably recently, I can't say that I always had a good, confident answer for any given attack technique that I may have been operationalizing with team members or something that I came up with on my own. So this is my attempt, you could say, to make amends with all the offensive techniques I've put out in the past and to try to develop and apply a somewhat more formalized methodology to actually get to the core of how do we take any technique in Windows, and this is going to be Windows endpoint specific, this being my particular area of comfort, and get to the bottom of how we can actually start detecting some things beyond what we already may know, like event log or procmon, and then using procmon to build sysmon rules. So I'm going to be talking about all that, and I've got some tricks and tips along those lines, but we're going to dig just a little bit deeper today. So who am I? My name is Matt Graber, Manifestation on Twitter. I'm a consultant at Spectre Ops. Extremely humbled to be here. One of the reasons I say that is because I've been living off the land with Chris Campbell here. So it's my first Derbycon. So I believe it was the second Derbycon. I gave my first InfoSec presentation there. And staying true to the living off the land methodology that Chris and I covered, we're also going to be living off the land somewhat here, only instead of using built-in tools to abuse functionality, we're going to use built-in tools and data sources to attempt to develop some novel detections. Okay? So you may have been approached with the following task. Replace this particular technique with any given TTP out there. All right? So where do you possibly start? Okay? And I ask myself this question a lot. In fact, I'm still learning every day how to get better at doing this thing, right? So this is a very broad ask, right? So WMI, I feel like I'm pretty comfortable with WMI. I've developed a few offensive techniques along those lines in my day. So now it's my turn to develop a generic detection for WMI-based lateral movement. All right? Well, so I see at least 3 things that are being asked of me. Detect, okay, so I need a detection that's going to be in the form of something actually tangible, right, that might surface as an alert to a SOC analyst and perhaps supply some valuable context to an incident responder. WMI based, all right, so there's a specific technology in there. And if you're familiar at all with WMI, you know that WMI spans a very broad swath of things, right, that attackers can abuse. Not only lateral movement, but persistence and many other things as well. And then lateral movement. So at least this kind of, by saying lateral movement, and we want to detect that kind of scopes our detection a little bit, right? So lateral movement being the overarching tactic, right? And then WMI being the more specific technique, right? So where do we even start? So I would suggest that we prioritize things a little bit first, okay? But first, the goal of this talk is, again, to establish a methodology for, this talk is really geared towards detection engineers to exploit all feasible data sources on a Windows endpoint, resulting in a detection that is ideally robust. In other words, resilient against attacker evasion techniques, which if you develop a brittle signature, it's going to be pretty trivial to bypass. So we'd like to mitigate that if at all possible. And to also identify data sources that supply sufficient context to both SOC analysts and incident responders. All right, so here is the strategy that I propose in going about detecting a generic attack technique on a Windows endpoint. First, we need to understand how attackers operationalize this technique. All right, so this ties into how we're going to prioritize the very broad ask that we just received of detecting WMI-based lateral movement. Okay, so we can look to threat intelligence, blog post, the Twitter sphere. There's going to be a lot of stuff out there. MITRE ATT&CK. Next, we're going to develop representative attack validations. So if we're building a detection, I like to refer to this as like the dynamic analysis portion of detection engineering. Right? We're not going to be able to develop a robust detection if we don't have a broad swath of validations that ideally cover as much as possible or all the known public attack variants of this given technique. All right? Because otherwise there's the big potential that we would be missing out on true positives, okay? Like actual attacks getting through our detection. The next thing that we'll do, and this should be familiar with everyone, is once you've developed your attack validations, you run them in your controlled environment, and then you just enumerate and observe all of the artifacts that occur. So what is the traditional thing that we do, right? We run our proof of concept attack suite perhaps see what events were generated in the event log, do a procmon trace to see what image loads occur, what process creation, network connections, registry access was made, so on and so forth, right? So we're fairly familiar with this step. But where we're going to dig a little bit deeper, and that's why I highlighted this here, is we'd also like to enumerate what it is that is actually observable, right? So I've identified a few things, right? The event log, procmon is a valuable tool in the detection engineer's tool chain. But is there anything beyond that? Are there any file-based logs that we could look at? Any other artifacts that we might be able to dig into that perhaps we're blind to currently as detection engineers? So I'm going to cover some methodology into how we can enumerate what is actually observable on a Windows endpoint. Next, we're going to attempt to understand the implementation of the technology. So this is the really fun part for me personally. As a reverse engineer, this is, to me, what makes detection engineering like really sexy, right? Like the realm of reverse engineering is not limited to just like vulnerability researchers and malware analysts. Detection engineers, too, can have plenty of fun reverse engineering. So what I'll cover is some steps in how you can go about identifying what the actual components are that implement the technique that you're investigating. And once you've identified those components, start digging in and reversing and gradually gaining more context and getting a bigger picture into how these potentially valuable data sources that you otherwise didn't consider previously are actually implemented under the hood, because this is what attackers are already doing. All right? And then next, we want to contextualize relevant data sources. Sometimes Microsoft is nice enough to document some of these things for me. But considering I mentioned the event log really just scratches the surface. And of all the events that can be captured in the event log, what percentage of those would you say are actually documented by Microsoft? It's probably a very small percentage. And we're going to go just beneath the surface of the event log too, where it's no man's land, where none of the stuff that we're going to see is actually documented. So it's going to be our job to document, i.e. supply context around the events and data sources that we discover along the way. And all of this is going to allow us to scope the detection, right? So once we gain a more holistic picture of how this technology is implemented, then we can use our scalpel to start carving out the data sources that we found to ideally find a valuable data source that can build a robust detection. All right. So first, we're going to prioritize, right? So again, WMI-based lateral movement is a very broad topic. There's a lot of ways to do it. But going through my research and armed with the knowledge that I already had, I know that attackers love Win32 process create-based lateral movement. Like this is WMI lateral movement on easy mode. It's really easy to implement. Attackers love to do it. They're still doing it. Just because it's easy doesn't mean well-funded advanced adversaries aren't going to use it. It's tried and true, and it still persists to this day. So for the purpose of this talk, we're going to scope our detection and data source analysis around just this particular procedure, right? So TTP procedure of Win32 process create-based lateral movements. And there are some good resources out there that I've highlighted here. Okay? So what I'd like to do is to start understanding the implementation of Win32 process create. So obviously when you call the create method of the Win32 process class, this doesn't just occur magically, right? There's code somewhere that executes a thing that does the thing that the attacker wants to achieve, right? So this being WMI, WMI allows us to query its own schema really well. And so the first line that you're seeing here is I'm getting an instance of the Win32 process class. And for every class in WMI, there's a provider attribute that's applied to the definition of that. And so that will have a value attached to it, which is a CLS ID or a GUID value, right? And when you see CLS ID, think COM, okay? So knowing that it's COM and you have a CLSID value, you can take that, go to the registry, and in the corresponding CLSID value in proc server 32, it will show you the corresponding COM DLL that implements, in this case, that WMI class. Okay, so in this case, we have simwin32.dll. All right, so add that to your notes of something to potentially investigate, because we'd like to ideally identify how the create call actually spawns a process on a remote machine. Okay, so digging in, we found this. So there's a call to create process as user W. So already, as a detection engineer, I'm thinking, well, okay, so create process, so process creation events in procmon 4688, those seem like they're going to be in play. Considering this is being done remotely and as another user, perhaps there is a logon session that's going to be created. So that's just another thing that I'll want to annotate and investigate. And I have the code that backs this too to actually dig in to validate. So if I'm not seeing an event that I expect, I can refer back to the disassembly to confirm whether or not my hypothesis is true. So this is within the simwin32 process class creation function. All right, so moving on, did a little bit of dynamic analysis. Actually, no, this was still static analysis. So following all the cross-references up from that process creation function call, going up and up and up, all the way to exec method, I'm starting to build out a map of the flow of execution when Win32 process create is called. And so each one of these functions here serves as a launch pad into a potentially new data source. It's going to be up to me, though, to quickly dive into the actual implementation, though. Okay? And as you can see, so the function call that's just, the function that calls process creation is check process creation. So we're kind of broadening the scope of the implementation here, but we're also just getting a much clearer picture of the overall flow of this implementation. All right. So we've dug in a little bit into the implementation. Now, through our various open source research, let's start developing some actual attack validations. Okay. And so the rationale to develop as many attack validations or like proof of concept validations as possible is to identify common and or distinct detection data sources across procedures. In other words, I refer to this as detection coverage, right? So if you're building a detection off of the execution of wmic.process_call_create, you very well could be limiting yourself, right? So if the goal is to detect WMI-based lateral movement, are you really detecting WMI-based lateral movement, or are you detecting attacker use of WMIC.exe for WMI-based lateral movement? So that's where you might want to get a little bit of clarification from whoever is requesting the detection. All right, so here's one attack validation. So here's how you would do WMI-based lateral movement using Win32 process create using WMIC.exe. So this is just one procedure for this TTP, WMIC, okay? And here's another one using PowerShell, using the older invoke WMI method or commandlet. So this under the hood is going to be pretty similar to WMIC. Where things get a little bit different potentially is you can also interact with WMI using the newer SIM commandlets. So here we establish a remote SIM session, which if you didn't know already, by default, WMI uses DCOM, the DCOM protocol. The SIM commandlets use WinRM. So a single port, single protocol, pretty nice. You can have everything work in a nice firewall-friendly manner. Right? So that's what we're afforded here. So we'd like to incorporate this into our attack validations as well. to get the broadest amount of coverage as possible. And then the last thing that came to mind for me was calling winrm.cmd or winrm.vbs. So these are all built-in utilities. Of course, there's you can call the APIs directly. There's other tools that can interact with WMI and like call Win32 process create. Like, we're just scratching the surface here, given the potential constraints of time and money that we have. All right? So let's start observing some detection artifacts. So here's where you would do your traditional analysis. All right, so for the first demo, what I'm going to do is this. So here's what I'm going to execute, and I'm just going to execute it locally. I would also want to be doing this remotely as well because we're actually testing lateral movement. But I'm going to call invoke sim method on Win32 process create and just spawn a notepad. And what I'm going to do right before that in PowerShell is annotate the time. I'm going to execute my thing, right? The lateral movement scenario, just sleep for a few seconds. And then I'm going to iterate through every event log where the event log date time entry is greater than or equal to what I took right before I executed it. Right? So the event log, as you know, is pretty huge. We don't want to be swimming in a sea of events, and this can really mitigate much of that and really let you get down to the potentially relevant events. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, we spawned a notepad. We're going to wait 5 seconds just to make sure the events are coming in. This will take a second to go through all of the event logs. And what do we have? Okay, some of these look familiar to you. At least 2 of these should look familiar, yeah? So 4688, these are our classic, man, this is hard to type with one hand. Our classic process auditing, okay? So here you see notepad was spawned. So we get some user context. It's spawned by what? WMI PRV SE, right? If you've investigated this before, this should be nothing new to you, okay? But I offer this as a handy tip. I use this all the time. Like, this is like step number 1 for me. I'm like, show me what I get in the event log, and I don't want to see of events, so only show me what occurred immediately before I executed my attack validation. Okay, so we have 4688, and then what's that last one there? That one looked kind of interesting. So this is event ID 5857 in Windows WMI activity operational log. SimWin32 provider started in a host process, WMI PRV SE, from this path. Okay, that's kind of interesting. I would annotate that. Now, this doesn't necessarily scream out to me lateral movement occurred, all right? So I know that WMI is pretty noisy, right? So anytime WMI is ever used, it's going to be loading these provider DLLs into the WMI service. So this, from my observations, is a pretty common thing. So this doesn't necessarily scream out to me that lateral movement occurred, and I'm not even getting any direct context saying that this thing executed remotely. Well, even though my example didn't execute remotely. Okay? So again, that is always pretty much step number 1 for me. Let me see what I get in the event log, because if I can get something great in the event log, then I'm going to go with that, because the event log is really easy to consume. All right? But the event log still leaves much to be desired. So moving on, we might utilize something like Procmon, which is an amazing tool to allow us to trace process creation, module loads, network connections, all that. I'm sure many of you are intimately familiar with Procmon. So I would absolutely use that as well because I want to be building up a holistic picture of what are all the components that are utilized in the course of executing my attack validation. But as a reverse engineer, right, like one of the first things I might execute would be something like strings, right? And so that could give me an initial sense of where I should start diving into. That's how I view Procmon from a detection engineering perspective. I don't necessarily trust that the events that I see populated in Procmon are 100% related to the attack validation that I was executing. But they can still serve as good hints for further deep dives, okay? So one thing that you might observe would be that anytime Win32 process lateral movement is performed, it always spawns a child process from wmiprvse.exe. So that is valuable. I don't want to negate the value of that. But is that going to give us enough context behind lateral movement? I mean, that's a judgment call, in my opinion. But from my experience, I would say largely no. Like, you could infer that, but you don't know for sure that that call originated from a remote attacker system. That's what I'd like to get at. That's the context that your SOC analysts and incident responders need, ideally. Okay, so can we do better? And I would propose that through ETW, we can. All right, so ETW is event tracing for Windows. I think we as the Derbycon community have been very fortunate that in years past there have been a large handful of ETW talks that I recommend you check out if you want to learn more about this. It's just such a rich source of events that if you learn how to tap into them properly, then you can really harness the power of these data sources underneath the hood of Windows. All right, so where I said that Microsoft only documents a fraction of the events in the event log, the amount of events that can be populated through ETW, that can be populated through the event log is a very tiny fraction of what ETW can publish. So the event log, if you didn't know, receives its events from ETW, okay? So let's cover some key terminology if you're not familiar with ETW. So ETW providers, these are the, think of it as a channel through which an event is written and consumed. Right? So there's code somewhere that says, hey, I want to log this thing, okay? So, okay, code, I'm going to go log this contextual event data for someone to consume it. Whoever consumes it, I don't care. If there's no one consuming it, then you really have a minimal perf impact. It was designed pretty well. But then when a consumer does come around, this is called an ETW trace session. This is the consumer of these events. So a trace session can subscribe to these providers, of which there are many, where each of which has its own unique GUID value, and many of which have human-readable names. So in manifest-based ETW, which we're going to be talking about mainly here, each one has a name, and they tend to be hyphen delimited. So the WMI one is Microsoft Windows WMI activity, right? And what's great about manifest ETW is that there's a binary somewhere that has serialized XML that stores the schema of all these events. So if you know how to capture that schema and recover it back into XML, then as detection engineers, we have some more data to go on to continue our investigation into this attack technique. Okay? Oh, a really important point here, channels. So every ETW event can have a property applied to it referred to as a channel. So if an ETW event has a channel value applied to it, that means that that ETW event is designed to be consumed by the event log. Many ETW events, though, do not have channel attributes applied to them, unfortunately. And that's what we're going to be dealing with in a little bit. Okay? So again, trace sessions, these are the consumers of the ETW provider events, and you can subscribe to one or many ETW events where take the application event log. The application event log is an ETW trace session. That's all it is. It's really nothing that special, okay? So ETW really is core to the data sources and detection telemetry available to us in Windows. Okay. So if you want to start digging around into the ETW provider schemas, what I recommend is this open source tool called WEP Explorer. And I have it up here. So we're going to dig in a little bit here. So this is what you'll see initially. Oh, sorry. Let me do interactive zoom. Okay, so all we're going to do is just search for our key term, right? We want to detect WMI, so let's search for WMI. And we get a few things here. And so if I was to choose, if I had to prioritize these, and there were a bunch of events in these, which one would I choose? Well, I would probably start with Microsoft Windows WMI activity. Why? Because when I was collecting events through the event log, I saw that there was one event in the WMI activity operational log that popped up. It didn't seem super relevant to me, but perhaps there might be some other relevant events in there. So I'm going to start here and double click that. And then you can go down here, and then here are all the events that this provider supports. Okay? Oh, and here's a channel tab. All right, so let's just go through this pretty much one by one. All right, ID. This is event ID. So if this is something that the event log can consume, this is the event ID that you would see. Now, there are logging levels in the event log in ETW, and so they can be applied to ETW events. It's not a requirement. Same with opcode, task, and keyword. Think of all these as the built-in ETW ways in which we can do filtering. It's unfortunate, actually, that using built-in ETW, you can't filter by event ID. You can only filter by these things here and keywords. And channels are actually just a special form of a keyword that the event log understands. And then what's also cool here is message. All right, so this, if we have any programmers here, this is just a format string, right? So %1, %2, %3. So these are placeholders for strings to be populated. Well, what strings are actually being populated? Well, we have that here in the fields column, okay? So what I would do at this point would just be to casually go through all of these and see if there's anything of potential interest. Now, some of these ETW providers, they're going to be many, many, many different events. So if you're swimming in a sea of events, then what I'll recommend is that you just run a trace to capture all these events and then weed through them and see which ones were actually captured. So it's sort of like the ETW equivalent of what we just did with the event log. And I'll show an example of that briefly. But what I wanted to show you here was I'm going to sort channel, and here we have some operational ones. So by default, you may know this already, the event logs that are enabled by default are the operational and admin event logs. So if you see an ETW event that has one of those channels applied to it, that means that it was designed to be consumed by the event log, okay? So what events in the WMI activity event log are designed to be consumed by the event log? Well, these here. All right, so some of you may have seen these before, but now we have some context. Let's see. Client process ID, host process. If you were to expand this out, what you'd find is that many of these are related to permanent WMI persistence. Okay, so this is out of the scope of our detection, but if it was in our scope, these would be extremely valuable data sources, which also happen to be consumable by the event log. So let me say that again. So if someone was to approach you to say, hey, does the event log X? This is how I would find out definitively. okay, I would find a potentially relevant ETW provider. In this case, I just searched for WMI. And I also got the hint from collecting event logs earlier that when I saw Microsoft Windows WMI activity, go to that corresponding ETW provider, go through the events, and look for all the events that have an operational or an admin channel applied to them. And that's what can be consumed by the event log. Cool? Now again, only a fraction of these are going to be actually documented by Microsoft. So this is always the fun part for me as a reverse engineer to obtain that context. And so I have some strategies for that. Another thing that we can investigate, so this is a great GUI utility. I think it has some limitations. I will also use perfview as well. This is a Microsoft utility. You have to download it. But this is the command that you would use to dump the schema for this ETW provider, Windows WMI activity. And the thing I find most valuable sometimes is you see that template ID there at the top. It says task underscore 023 args. So 023 refers to the event ID in this case. Sometimes these schemas will have really nice names applied to them. Okay? In this case, it didn't. So we're going to have to dive into the code to actually verify what this event actually corresponds to. But this looks kind of cool, potentially, this event ID 23, right? Because we get command line. And we get user and client machine is local, all right? So we're adding this to our notes for things to investigate. So we've collected some good potential information that we'd like to investigate further. So let's go ahead and start that investigation. So we're going to collect a WMI trace at this point, and we're going to use, well, I'm going to use logman.exe, which is a built-in utility. It's in System 32. This is the main command line utility in Windows to control ETW trace sessions. So logman start, okay, we want to start something. What do we want to start? We want to start a trace. We give it a name, so I just called it WMI trace. -P stands for provider. So we specify the provider name right there. And then we give it a keyword value. So if we wanted to filter on certain keyword values, we could. But instead, so this is a 64-bit value. I'm just setting all the bits to 1, meaning I want to collect all the keywords. I don't want to do any filtering on any of the events that are going to be collected in this trace. And then 0xFF, this byte refers to the log level. Okay? I don't care about the log level. I don't want to filter. Just give me all the events. And then I'm going to output it to a trace file, an ETL file. Okay? And then ETS is, I think it's like a real-time trace session. I just always use that and always forget what it means. Okay, so after we run that, we're going to run our attack scenarios, or our attack proof of concept attack validations after the trace has started. And then when we're done doing that, we're going to stop our trace with logman stop. And then it's been my observation in Windows 10, and I haven't really investigated this, but generally speaking, ETL files are not very usable. At least in previous versions of Windows, the relevant schemas for the ETW provider would not be applied to the ETL file. So an ETL file would just consist of the raw trace data with no human readable context around it. So what you'd have to do is use another built-in utility called tracerpt to convert the ETL to an EVTX file, which is going to be human readable. And so the process under the hood that happens there is tracerpt knows how to recover the ETW provider schema and apply it to the raw data in the ETL and then convert it to something actually usable. In this case, an EVTX, but it also supports CSV and XML. All right, so after I ran my trace, and I think I have this handy here. Oh man, this is hard. Okay. So after we ran our trace, let's look at some of the events. And there were many events logged. And ETW, when you do an ETW trace, just fair warning, it can be very noisy. The ones that looked potentially relevant to lateral movement were event ID 11, 12, 22, and 23, which when going into WP Explorer, none of which had the operational or admin channels applied to them. Okay, so these cannot be consumed by the event log. Okay, so let's start digging into let's start trying to extract some context from these events. All right, so here's the first one, event ID 11, kind of interesting. Okay, Win32 process create, we get the client machine, so that's kind of interesting. It looks like we could get context from the client that initiated the lateral movement. We get some stuff about the namespace and whatnot, so that's potentially interesting here. Event ID 12, so Win32 process create right there, all right. That's pretty handy, and we get like a corresponding DLL path. So we got that event in the event log earlier that said that SimWin32 was loaded. It looks like this event ID tells us why, because Win32 process create was called. So that corresponding provider was loaded. Event ID 22, we get some additional interesting contextual information potentially related to the lateral movement activity. And then my favorite, event ID 23, which also includes the command line of what was executed. All right. So just by observing this, you get some potential good ideas, but do you understand completely the context behind each one of those fields? The answer is probably no, and it certainly was for me. So I had to dig in a little bit, and this is what I came up with. So I'll just kind of leave this here for your reference for when I publish the slides later. But this is the result of doing some RE to extract the context for each one of these fields. And what's amazing, in my opinion, for these events were the following key findings. So notepad.exe was started, and it started with a corresponding process ID. So we get that. But we also get the process ID of the source process, right? So we get the process ID from the attacker machine as well. There's some solid SOC and IR context right there. We get the command line of what was executed. We get the user context the command was executed in. We get the host and fully qualified domain name of the client machine, the attacker machine. We get the WMI provider, namespace, class name, and method name. So validation that Win32-based lateral movement was performed. We get an indication that the WMI operation was performed remotely via the isRemote field. So super valuable stuff right here, which unfortunately is not consumed by the event log. But there are ways that we can tap into it. All right, so how would we go about obtaining this context? The strategy that I've been using a lot is I mentioned that an ETW provider has a GUID value applied to it. So a GUID is just a sequence of 16 bytes, right? So if you just search all the binaries like in System32 or like in C Windows or recurse through there, looking for that byte sequence, then what you'll find is the following. And I've got some code to do this. I'll release all the code as well. So here I'm just forming a binary regex to look for that corresponding WMI activity ETW provider. And here's what I came up with. So I only found these 3 DLLs. AIT static is not relevant. That's related to like telemetry. MI utils wasn't super relevant. I forget what it was for. But WBEM COM-N looked like the absolute like relevant component here that I wanted to dig into. So I started digging into it. And what was handy too with this code that I provided was that it gave you the file offset of where that byte sequence occurred. So considering we're talking about PEs here, P has section headers, so we can map the file offset to the virtual address. So we can just map directly that file offset to the address in IDA and have it take us directly to where that GUID that ETW provider good is defined in the code, which is pretty cool. Some additional context I might want to know is, okay, WBEM-COM-N looks interesting. What processes load that DLL? All right, so this is the one-liner in PowerShell I might use to find that out. And it turns out that this is only loaded by the Win Management or WMI service and the WinRM service. Okay, so I would take this, and what I would do here is, so I have it here. I'm going to follow this cross-reference. And it takes me to this code here. Let me zoom in a little bit. And it calls ETW event register. And so what you do when you call ETW event register is it returns a handle. So we want to register, we want this code to be able to write to WMI activity events. And any code that does that has to use this handle. So now I'm going to follow cross-references to this handle, and we get some interesting stuff here. So what stood out to me pretty much right away was the highlighted function here, publish Win32 process creation. So let me click on that. And what's called here is ETW event write. Okay, so what is actually being written? Here's where you need some context, right? So you look up on MSDN all the arguments for ETW event write, and you would look at its corresponding event descriptor, which indeed, so the first field in the structure is hex 17 or decimal 23, that event ID 23. So we've positively identified the code that generates this event. Okay. Cool. Now, that function happened to be an export function. So my next question was, okay, what code calls that export function? And I have a one-liner for that as well. And it turns out WBM core.dll is the only one that calls that. So we're starting to build out this picture even further of the implementation, in this case on the server side. So here's what the call trace would look like if you were doing this dynamically. So some additional interesting context there. All right, and then as you start digging into this, so let's put our attacker hats on, and I see these comparisons being made. It's looking for the literal string Win32 process and create. Well, I happen to know that you can clone any WMI class to the name of your choosing. So you could clone it to say be Win32 not a process and then call the create method. Right? So having identified the code and seen the implementation, I thought, oh, here's a new attack variant that I might be able to try. And it turns out it's still logged. I haven't really dug into why. That could warrant some further investigation. But I would have only figured this out if I, like having gone through the steps that I'm highlighting here, right? So there are some additional data sources as well if we want to keep going into the weeds. If we find that ETW, manifest-based ETW is not giving us the answers that we're looking for. And we can achieve those by digging into WPP and trace logging. These are other ETW-based data sources used primarily for debugging and telemetry purposes. So I personally don't recommend building detections off these. Microsoft actually does. They build some detections off trace logging data sources. I don't have time to get into the weeds there, but I gave a talk at Recon about this topic, and I have a pretty extensive blog post on this. Okay, so in summary, we've identified what can be logged through ETW. We've identified the code that performs the logging, and in doing so, we started to understand the components involved in the technology. And in beginning to reverse engineer these components, we started to gain some insight into how an attacker might go about evading our detections. And in this case, we got lucky with an extremely valuable data source. In this case, event ID 23. All right, so cool story, bro, but like, what am I actually supposed to do with ETW? All right, so therein lies the challenge. There are tools out there that can allow you to collect these ETW events at scale in varying manners, right? So Defender ATP, and I'm sure there's other commercial products out there as well that tap into ETW, like do so in an extremely efficient and like performant manner. So like that's out there if you've got some cash to burn Defender ATP is like really good at that. If you're looking for open source, like amazing options that are out there for your experimentation purposes, there's Crabs ETW, which was open sourced by Microsoft, and Silk ETW by FuzzySec at FireEye. Both amazing tools that I encourage you to investigate if you want to dig into this further. So thanks a lot. I don't have time for questions.